Josh Rowe, it's a pleasure to have you here live with us in the Single Track Studio, Olympic Valley, California. We're not publishing this the week of Western States. It'll be out, I believe, the Wednesday or Thursday after States. But I think before we get into the nuts and bolts of all of Brett and I's nutrition-based questions, tell the audience your role at Maurten, what that means in lay terms, and what you're doing here at Western States today.
Thanks for having me on. It's a bit daunting actually from the guests you've had the last couple of days, then to kind of have me is, feels like a big act to follow. But my role at Maurten is I'm kind of a performance scientist, so I do a lot of product development, work in the chemistry and formulation team, within the nutrition team, and it's a bit of a kind of dual role where we do product development, but then also a lot of kind of sports science support with our athletes, and that's kind of how we kind of work in terms of our R&D. Is we do a lot of kind of investigative work on kind of sports, such as I say like ultra endurance running, Ironman, marathon running, and really try and understand the sport in its whole entirety. So not only just from a nutritional perspective, but also from a psychological, physiological perspective as well. So and really the last couple of days, it's very much for us is understanding ultra endurance. If you look at the from a scientific perspective, there's not really a great deal of research that really supports like ultra endurance in terms from a nutritional perspective and the nutritional strategies. So we've got a big project over the last year, kind of working with like Killian and Tom to really understand ultra endurance and how we can really not only improve the nutritional strategies, but also just see what is going on there from a physiological standpoint.
You said there that there are still a lot of unknowns in our sport when it comes to nutrition. Maurten, of course, is working to address those. Is that the reason why you're so fascinated in this space, that there's so many unknowns out there and you have the opportunity this year and in the ensuing years to crack some codes out there? Or what brings you into this space so excited?
It's most probably exactly that. If we look at the spaces where we're very dominant in, like marathon running, cycling, there's a whole body of research there that really supports like the athlete's nutritional strategy. So there's a lot of research that says like athletes what carbohydrates they need, the types, the dose, the frequency, and also how to kind of train the gut. But then if you look at the literature there for ultra endurance, it's almost a bit of like a black hole. There's nothing there. There's like general kind of advice and recommendations, but there's nothing really fully understanding what's going on with the athlete. And the beauty really of like ultra running is no distance is the same. So almost like the data we're collecting, say during UTMB, is completely different to what's going to be at Western States. And that's another kind of exciting bit, is because not only is the race completely different, but also how the athletes need to kind of train and adapt to that it's completely two different events. So for us, it's just understanding the sport, because not many people do. And I think the last couple of years, like ultra endurance has got more maybe like professionalized, and for us is just to kind of like help that and give more scientific recommendations, not only just for the elite athletes, but also just for the everyday athletes as well.
Since you've come into the research and development side of the sport, are there any unknowns that have now become known since you've been working with Maurten, or like any, I don't know if I want to say like major breakthroughs, but things that were maybe once believed that have already changed quite a bit since you've been in with them?
That's a good question. I'd say it's definitely most probably the abundance of carbohydrates required. Most probably a couple of years before that, it was very much just as an event where everyone knows you need to almost completely eat. It's kind of like the Ironman. It's like the fourth discipline, and that's kind of like with ultra endurance. It's very much just like I think Killian calls it like a moving buffet. It's just you've got to constantly trying to eat. And what we've seen is most probably in the last couple of years. Previously, it was very much how much calories you can get in, and no one was really not too bothered about the macronutrient distribution or the micronutrient. It was very much just let's just get as many calories in as possible. Whereas now that kind of is really shifting to carbohydrates. It's how much carbohydrates you can get in, and if you can maximize your carbohydrate intake, there's effects there where it can not only say improve your performance, may help kind of stabilize or preserve maybe some of your glycogen stores, but there's also now research that's showing that the bigger carbohydrate intake you can have, it can help with maybe say like your muscle recovery or help maybe delay the muscle fatigue. So this is what's getting interesting in the sense of, because the races are getting quicker, like this weekend, they're saying that maybe the second half is going to be pretty quick, or maybe the last kind of 10 miles to 10k. And what we're seeing is like the more carbohydrates you can have during kind of them early stages, because you'll be able to kind of regulate and kind of help maybe preserve maybe the muscle glycogen, but your liver glycogen, but then also the soreness as well, the fatigue. It means that the athletes must probably going to be able to go quicker in that kind of second half. And that's, if we look what we've seen from cycling to marathon running before, when Maurten came onto the kind of the stage, the marathon was very much you hold a pace, and then whoever could kind of like, it was just the second half was who could last the longest, who would almost be able to delay the onset of fatigue. Whereas, and that's completely changed now. Like you look at the marathon times, people are running negative splits. They're running a lot quicker in the second half, and this is almost what we're starting to see now within ultra running, because the nutrition is starting to get more refined. It means that the athletes, as less people are kind of bonking or blowing up. It's always going to be the case, but it's less is going to happen.
Yeah, it definitely seems like in the last few years there's been a huge narrative shift in terms of I consume this many calories per hour to I consume this many grams of carbohydrates per hour. And it seems like, yeah, there's still, I would say the ultra world is still lacking in regards to like what the current cutting edge is. And it seems like from an endurance sport kind of standpoint, running has always been a handful of years behind cycling. Like, is there anything in the cycling world that's being done right now that you still see like being like glaringly omitted in the running and ultra world?
I think again it comes down to the quantities and maybe how cyclists are using their carbohydrates. But then also there's things like bicarb. That's been very much in cycling. It's been very predominant. It's been used quite a lot. But
what are the benefits there?
With bicarb is very much a product which kind of like helps regulate your acid-base balance. So when you're working at really high intensity, you'll produce lactic acid. People always really associate that lactic acid, which kind of starts to stop the athlete from almost exercising. It starts the onset of fatigue. But actually, it's not the lactic acid, not the lactate, the buildup of lactate, which is causing the impairment in performance. It's the abundance of hydrogen ions that are going to be in either the muscle and the bloodstream. And your body naturally produces bicarbonate. But by ingesting sodium bicarbonate, what it means is you can elevate your abundance of bicarbonate in the bloodstream. So when you start to exercise at high intensity, the body has more capacity to kind of buffer them hydrogen ions, which means it can kind of delay maybe the onset of fatigue, allow athletes to run, have a bigger power output, run further for longer. So that's really interesting. And I think, as we said, like we're in cycling, it's been very much like it's been well trusted, like sodium bicarb, but cyclists really haven't really used it just because of the GI issues, what's normally kind of been pretty much plagued with sodium bicarb ingestion. But with Maurten kind of resolving a lot of that, it's kind of opened up the door for bicarb. And what we've seen is, we always knew it was going to be very kind of popular within cycling, but then now it's starting to kind of transpire into running. And what we're seeing as well is the use of it within ultra endurance, which again for us is very much in this early kind of development phase of understanding the true effects of sodium bicarb during the ultra endurance.
Yeah, there's definitely was a lot of I don't know if it was even speculation, a lot of chatter around Killian coming through Courmayeur and sitting down.
What was that bowl?
It was this translucent bowl with the Maurten logo on it, and he was just going to town eating this weird goopy stuff, and it gets his finger pricked, and everyone, I mean, there's thousands of people watching the live stream, and not a single person had any idea what it was that he was eating, now that the product has come out, he was eating sodium bicarb. So there's still benefits to even consuming the bicarb in a 20-hour race when even someone like Killian might not touch those, higher zones that are going to build up that lactate in the blood?
Yeah, so this is really still like in the early exploratory phases, and we're quite fortunate that we have like the likes of like Tom, Killian as like our guinea pigs. We have other athletes, but it was very much we did a series of before as the build up say to UTMB. He did a series of races, and we did a lot of kind of support and testing. And one of the times we kind of tested the bicarb, and if you must probably looked at the literature, it would very much you'd say there's no reason to use bicarb. It's very much within that power domain, that anything from 90 seconds to 10-minute kind of range. But what we see, especially with like ultra endurance runners, is if you look at the whole entirety of the race, yes, the most probably the intensity is relatively quite low, but there's almost them kind of micro periods where if they're kind of going up a hill or there's kind of get to a technical component of the course, chances are the body's going to be mostly working at high capacity, and they'll start to produce a significant amount of lactate. And also what we've seen is from like the research is that when you measure in lactate, it's very much from the blood, is almost like a whole body measurement. You're measuring the concentration of lactate in the body. And what we find is that actually most probably when an athlete, say like a ultra endurance athlete, them components where it is technical and say going up a sharp kind of like hill, they are most going to produce a significant amount of lactate. But because the intensity again is maybe relatively low, that concentration, so some of the muscle groups will be working really hard, whereas some won't be working as hard. So then to try and identify it in the concentration of blood, it doesn't really, you're not going to see the similar responses of say a track athlete where they're producing massive lactate responses. But what we're getting from is like the feedback and from when we're evaluating some of the data is that again it helps kind of like regulate the acid base balance. So it means that when they're doing the kind of them either it gets technical or they're having them kind of micro periods where they're working at really high intensity, their acid base balance is more regulated. So it means that they can almost, the perception of effort maybe feel a little bit less, but then also the recovery. And it all almost comes down to if you can kind of regulate the acid base balance in a more controlled manner for the whole entirety of the race. So if it's say a 20-hour race or a 15-hour race or maybe 14 hours and 30 minutes this weekend, hopefully. 14:28, yeah. It means that if you can regulate it for as long as possible, when it gets to kind of that serious part of the race, or I don't know when the serious part, but if it gets that final bit where it's going to be quick, most probably the last final miles, with the bicarb, it's meant that it's just helped regulate the muscles and the acid base balance. So they're going to most probably be in a better place and better position to pick up the pace.
Maybe change it. Well, actually, did you have a follow-up on that?
Go ahead.
I kind of wanted to talk about the differences between a liquid-based calorie strategy, carbohydrate strategy at Western States, and more of like a what do you call it? Like a physical carb strategy at Western States. Like we've heard Tom Evans talk about how in 2019 he was completely liquid-based carbs. We just had Arlen Glick on the show. He has the chance to win Western States on Saturday. I believe he's doing the Maurten 320 mix, and then he'll throw some Coca-Cola in there at times. But a lot of these top performers are going liquid calories the whole way. Can you talk about some of the theory behind that strategy for a race like Western where it's like 15, 16 hours to win it? And then when you would switch away from that, like as the race gets longer, like at a UTMB?
Yeah, I think it all just comes down to the intensity of the race. Like if you look at Western State, it is a quicker race. And like, yes, 14 hours is a long time. But if you looking at it from the whole entire, like if it's going to be a quick race, so having things where it's maybe in like more solid form and having say your carbohydrates in that way, it just means that the GI tract is going to have to metabolize and break that down and work a little bit harder. And if there are athletes who are already going to be working at most probably a relatively high intensity than they might do at UTMB, then it just means that when they're kind of consuming carbohydrates in that form, it's just putting maybe more strain on the GI tract. Whereas having it in more liquid form, Western States it's relatively warm, maybe might not be as warm this year, but it's still a warm ultra. So it helps with kind of that hydration and replenishment of water, of liquid, but then also it's just more of the ease of getting the carbohydrates in. As you say, as an athlete, as they're working at higher intensity, the blood flow starts to deviate from the GI tract. So when an athlete is working at high intensity, the GI tract is almost relatively quite impaired. So when you're trying to have a significant amount of carbohydrates in there, it means that the body can't really metabolize or kind of break that down because it's been impaired in terms of its function. And now with the kind of the idea of having more and more carbohydrates, it means that you've got to kind of have a fueling strategy that's going to be kind of quite easy on the GI tract and take them pressures away. So I think that's kind of why a lot of athletes are kind of maybe swaying towards a more liquid form, is one, to ease the pressure from the GI tract, but then also kind of help with the fluid retention.
I just read an article that I think actually might have come out yesterday on the POC website, that I don't know if you helped write the article or it was an interview, but they talked a lot about the importance of also proper hydration and how dehydration, everyone knows that you should stay hydrated, but the article did a great job of breaking down like the increase in the blood plasma volume and how that can lead to a cardiovascular drift. I would love to know a little bit more about that because, two of the biggest reasons why people's races at Western States, fall apart are, they overheat, oftentimes leads to dehydration, and then that exertion of effort stays the same or goes up and their power goes down. Or, the nutrition plan goes sideways, oftentimes relating to the heat too. And seems like I'm learning more and more about how much of that can start from not being properly hydrated. So what can someone, who's competing at Western States, what can they do to not run into those problems?
It's a full question that.
I know. I think I might have lumped like 5 questions in there because I just read the article and there's so many questions in my head. But we could start with just the dehydration element in relation to the blood plasma volume.
Yeah. So you say hydration status is pretty much essential. You kind of want to make sure, especially when it's hot, but even if it is cool, to have a kind of a constant stream of fluids to kind of help kind of replenish that. And a big factor of that is to kind of help really just with kind of the regulation of kind of the body to kind of metabolize the carbohydrates, but also just for the muscle function. And a big component is when an athlete is exercising, especially somebody in Western State, it's going to be hot. They'll need to kind of have optimized kind of the thermoregulatory response. And a way to do that is to kind of be efficient in sweating, to kind of help kind of control the kind of the heat temperature. And if you, as soon as you kind of start to kind of have a low kind of like fluid intake, then that kind of the sweat rate would go down, which then means your thermoregulatory system would most probably start to kind of drift, and you will get then the things like cardiac drift, and because it means that the body has to kind of work harder. You've got high core body temperature, and the whole kind of purpose is to kind of control that body temperature, because the body is relatively in some cases quite inefficient in the sense of for it to kind of produce mechanical work, it needs to produce heat, and that's kind of one of the biggest kind of outputs of exercise is the heat generation. And during a prolonged period of a race, like say like an ultra endurance race, that kind of heat production is going to be relatively quite high. And then if you're going to put some athletes in some almost like a sauna environment, then it just means that it's just going to create greater strain on the body. So by controlling the core body temperature means that they can relatively maximize performance.
I'd love to have some conversations around protein and caffeine as well. Like I think Tom Evans published this on social media a few weeks ago, saying something to the effect of high caffeine works. Like this high caffeine nutritional strategy works. And I would love to know your thoughts on that. Like based on what you've seen Tom do in training and maybe other athletes, is there like a surprisingly new threshold that you can get away with in terms of hourly caffeine intake that might surprise listeners and viewers?
Caffeine's really relative to the individual. You get some people where they are responders, you get some that aren't responders, and it's not as kind of clean throat. But with caffeine, it is tricky, especially with like in a hot environment. There is like, yes, it can improve your performance, but also caffeine is a thermoregulator. So it means that it can increase your core body temperature when you ingest caffeine. So I think a lot of the work with Tom is kind of understanding like like maximizing the caffeine intake without kind of compromising that kind of thermoregulatory control. So yeah, it's almost like a bit of a trade-off in the sense of you've got to make sure that if you are a responder and you enjoy kind of the components of the benefits of caffeine, that you kind of use it in almost at the appropriate kind of time points. So if it's going to be, say, most probably in a really kind of hot environment, then your most probably caffeine intake would want to kind of be relatively reduced. But then that doesn't mean once you kind of maybe come out of that ridiculously hot environment and you kind of need that pickup, then you can almost resort to the caffeine. So again, it's really hard to say. You could have, everyone can have, let's say, 120 milligrams of caffeine per hour, because it's not the case. Everyone's kind of individual. Some people get benefits off caffeine, maybe having 50 milligrams per hour. Some people might have it where they need a bigger intake.
And I guess what are some of these benefits from caffeine during, ultra endurance events?
I think a big aspect is more like the perception you kind of feel more alert. Like if you're running for like anything from 8 to 14 to 20 hours, the kind of that perception, that fatigue, that kind of neuromuscular fatigue, but also just the psychological fatigue takes its toll. And like caffeine, it can just kind of, it's more just from a pick-me-up. It just gives the athletes something when it gets maybe to a technical component of the course. They know they need to be a bit more wary. That's kind of where caffeine can be used to just kind of increase their alertness a little bit more.
Now I'm starting to think about like Maurten's entire product range. I guess
are we talking hydrogels now?
I did have a hydrogel question. So, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the hydrogels are glucose and fructose, right? Are they mostly glucose?
And then the drink mix is fructose and maltodextrin?
Yeah, so our hydrogel products, so there's like, you've got the carbohydrates, and the hydrogels are almost like a separate component, but that's what creates. So we have the drink mixes, which use maltodextrin and fructose, and then the gels use glucose and fructose. And
why is that in terms of the ingredient differences?
It's very much for the drink mixes, is just for the osmolarity. So it's just to reduce the osmolarity of the carbohydrate drinks if it had, say, glucose in. It's just a way. But in terms of how your body metabolizes, say, maltodextrin to glucose, it's relatively, there's not really that much difference.
It's pretty similar.
Yeah.
Okay. But and then fructose is added in because that is absorbed through a different pathway?
Yeah.
Okay.
So your body kind of has a limit where from the research it's kind of said that anything from, say, like 1 to 1.1 grams per grams per minute of glucose can be transported through the glucose transporters. And by using multiple transporters, it means that once, say, the glucose transporter is saturated, then you can get kind of carbohydrates, so fructose, which uses a different transporter, through a different avenue. So it's just kind of like thinking of it as almost like a road or like a traffic. It's like you've got one road which kind of directs all of the glucose, and then you've got another road that directs all of like the fructose. So if you've got a big traffic on, say, the glucose, then it's kind of going to get kind of a backlog, and what you don't want to have is, pardon?
Like a bypass.
Exactly, yeah. It's just kind of like, bypassing the glucose transporters. Yeah.
Do you know, are there any third lanes that exist? Like, is there a third way to...
You talking about ketones?
I didn't say ketones.
You talking about ketones?
I was just asking if there was any research on any third lanes for carbohydrate or other various energy intake lanes.
Sources.
Just wondering if if Maurten been looking into ways to expand the freeway.
There's ketones, but that's almost like in a different form. But I think when we're looking at purely from a carbohydrate perspective, they're almost, you have got them lanes, but there is a capacity to almost increase kind of not only the tolerance but the transportability. So what we're starting to see now, especially from the elite athletes, is they're able to tolerate not only high carbohydrate intake, but the body's able to do a lot more with that carbohydrates. And if you look at some of the research that's been previously, it's very much a sense of like sometimes maybe someone who's like the everyday athlete, that 90 grams of carbohydrates could be relatively optimum for them, and that's kind of based off what the research has said, like 90 grams of carbohydrates. But now when we're looking at, say, from an elite perspective, from what we're seeing is they're able to tolerate and also metabolize and utilize more than 90 grams, getting close to that 100 to 120.
Wow. I want to ask you a philosophical question, because Brett has talked about this a lot as it relates to heat training. Like, Brett made this prediction that with all the resources we have available today, you can, in the technology, you can kind of solve for the heat at Western States. Like with all of the topical cooling strategies, et cetera, you can kind of solve for that and make yourself stay cool throughout the day. As it relates to nutrition, because you talked about, Tom, it being a very personal thing with caffeine, in how short a window can an athlete figure out exactly what they need from a nutritional standpoint to not run into as many GI issues on race day? Or is it sort of like a lifelong thing where like you're always going to be tinkering and you're always going to be fine tuning? You know what I mean? Like, in how short a window could someone nail this if they looked at all the research out there, they ran the tests on themselves, they were in Maurten labs and stuff like that? Like,
can you train the gut?
Can you train the gut, and can you figure out your gut in, like, for example, like a 2-month window, and then be solved for the rest of your like career?
I don't think you'd be completely solved. Like, the problem is you must probably be able to achieve more, but there's always like more you can do. But I think in like the short period of time, say that 2-month window, you could achieve quite a lot. What you tend to find is athletes, their kind of the carbohydrate or GI tolerance maybe start off relatively low, but with an appropriate kind of gut trainability protocol, you can significantly increase your carbohydrate tolerance. And one of the benefits of kind of the Maurten products is it gives you almost that greater starting point, because the Maurten products with the hydrogel technology helps with the delivery of carbohydrates and relieves a lot of the pressure of the GI tract. It means that you could most probably start with a greater increase of carbohydrates with the hydrogel technology than carbohydrates that don't have the hydrogel technology. But you could always most probably maximize and get a little bit more.
What does a gut training protocol look like? Like, what are the elements of it?
It's very much quite similar to like a normal kind of training protocol, like where you have like your intensity and your load. What you really want to start with a good training protocol is identify what your tolerance is. So it might say start off at maybe I can tolerate quite comfortably 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But maybe for Western States, you want to get close to that 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrates. And it's very much just kind of following a typical kind of training program. You want to slowly increase your carbohydrate intake during the sessions. And what you want to do is kind of play around with when you want to have them key, almost like carbohydrate sessions. So you might have like overcompensation sessions where it would be very just quite a low intensity, but during that session you might have maybe 20 to 25% more carbohydrates than what you would be aiming for. And that's kind of just to kind of train the gut, put a greater stress on the gut, and then help it kind of be utilized. What you sometimes don't want to do is start off almost like you've got, say, your key kind of specific kind of sessions, really trying to maximize the carbohydrate intake in them sessions, because what you don't want to do is have a massive impact on the session. So if you do get GI issues, then it will. So it's just playing around with using, you have, say, your ultra marathon specific sessions, and then you might have like a medium long run in the week where it's very much just like a time on your feet. They're the sessions where you kind of want to overcompensate and kind of maximize the intake.
Is there a max amount of fluid that like my gut could absorb per hour, or is that something that could also be trained? Because I always hear, especially at Western States, like there was just no amount that I could drink to keep up with how much I was sweating. How much of that is just humans being humans versus something that you could potentially increase over the course of your training?
You could always increase your tolerance and your uptake, but there most probably is going to be a limit, and that limit might be individual for everybody. But if you're looking at, say, the ultra, the chances are you're never going to be able to completely replenish all of, say, the carbohydrates and the fluid during the race. It's just because like say with the increase in sweat rate and the utilization of your glycogen, it's probably going to be very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
But you could get relatively quite close.
So like if Brett's my coach, hypothetically, if on a given Saturday he gives me a 2-hour run, he might also prescribe like, I want you to fuel 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And then the next week, as he ramps up the long run to 3 hours, he might say, oh, in addition, I want you to test 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour on that run. Is that kind of how you would see the ramp up? Like over the course of 7 days, you would increase it by 10 grams per hour?
Yeah, depending, as you say, you want to make sure that you're reviewing after that session to say, like, see how your gut responds. So say if that session you had the 60 and you felt like it felt like a little bit more pressure on the GI tract and you felt a little bit more uncomfortable, then that week would be very much more, if you did have maybe like shorter sessions or just a shorter run. Again, sometimes you might think that you need to fuel for that specific session, but what you're doing is, say if you're just going for an hour run like a midweek, you could have a really kind of aggressive carbohydrate intake just to kind of maximize the intake. What you want to do is really stress the GI tract when it's almost during that low intensity kind of sessions. And then once you've kind of overstressed the GI tract in the low intensity and you've got that adaptation, then you can start to kind of embed that in within the actual kind of like ultramarathon specific workouts.
This has been so great.
How about protein? Can we talk protein? Because we're starting to see a lot of gels out on the market that are marketing the benefits of, having somewhere between 1 and call it 3 or 4 grams of protein. Maybe it could be per hour on the run, and that will help not necessarily mid-run, but in facilitating recovery post-run. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that? And talk maybe about Maurten's decision to either include protein in some of their mixes or to leave it out explicitly.
Yeah, so there's a bit of research showing that having anything from like 5 to 10 grams of protein per hour can help with kind of like supporting like the muscle recovery. So by having almost like micro dosages during an ultra endurance event, it almost will kind of stimulate protein synthesis. So of that stimulation, it means it kind of help maybe with the regeneration and also the recovery. So there is research that's starting to support that, but it's really still in its infancy. So for us at Maurten, we have development products that are targeting that, and that most probably some will be used. But it's very much for us is because the research is in its infancy, we don't want to kind of release a product where we don't truly know it's going to either improve the athlete's performance and health, and that's maybe sometimes some frustration for some people where they say, oh, we have a very limited product range, but a lot of R&D and time goes into the products, and we want to make sure that they truly do work.
Yeah, what's the typical time frame look like for a Maurten product going from maybe an idea to R&D to actually hitting the shelves? What's the testing window usually like, or has it varied from product to product?
It varies in terms of its complexity. So if we look at the bicarb, that was almost a 2.5 year project. But we had athletes, once we did a lot of chemistry formulation, internal work, did a lot of laboratory testing internally. Once we kind of got happy with the formulation and kind of its performance, we then would kind of go out to our athletes and lucky at Maurten, we have some like the best guinea pigs in the world, so we tested with them. But it was almost in the testing phase for about 18 months before it went live commercially, and we had athletes that kind of still won Olympic gold medals, world championships, broke world records. So, but the main kind of the importance for us is to make sure that when we do develop a product, we're kind of very happy for it before we then release it to the elite athletes, and kind of we can then get feedback on them, see how they use it, get a good understanding of the product, and then once we really truly understand the product, then we'll release it to the mass market. So for the bicarb, it's maybe a 2.5 year project. For some of our other products, that could be maybe a year, but we would never most probably turn something around in maybe like 2 to 3 months, because what we want to do with our products is to have a good understanding of like how it be used in a full training cycle, and then also within a race. And some of our products, they might be used in different situations. So say for cycling, we want to understand how it's used within a cycling season. Say for the ultra marathons, we want to like understand how it's both used, say within Western States, but then UTMB, they're both completely different events, and that takes time. We can't just replicate and say get an athlete to go on the treadmill and simulate that in the lab. We really need to be out there in the field, and that's kind of like what we're doing now. Is some of our products they are in development, and we really want to kind of stress test them as much as possible.
Has the research and development side of Maurten grown in the last few years as the product line has as well?
Yeah, we still have quite a small team in our like the R&D team, but yeah, like the team is growing. Like as Maurten as a company as a whole has grown exponentially, which has been really exciting. But again, in terms of from an R&D perspective, we're still quite controlled in kind of how we approach our product development. And yeah, we don't want to just kind of create things for the sake of creating things. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of why we want to have quite a tight-knit R&D development team, just to make sure that we're doing the right things the right way. Like we have a really good head of research, Maurten, and he comes from the medical background, and his kind of approach to kind of answering problems and solving problems is really unique. So it's kind of making sure we kind of protect kind of that thought process, and making sure we do things properly.
I think one question I have, and it's probably just acknowledging some viewers, some listeners out there who are naturally skeptical. Are there any interesting or compelling cases in the literature that you've seen against hydrogel technology or the bicarb product that you think are worth stating, and then maybe offering a counter argument to?
So I think in the early days of like the hydrogel technology and kind of when it was researched, a lot of the research kind of really showed that it wasn't shown to have a performance benefit, or it wasn't shown to reduce the athlete's GI symptoms. But then when we looked at kind of a lot of the research, it was very much specifically on it all came down to the exercise intensity. And a big part of my PhD was very much looking at how carbohydrate intake is affected by exercise intensity and what the optimum dose is. And what you find is that as exercise what traditionally was thought is that as exercise increases, GI response increases like linearly. But that's not really the case. What happens is as exercise intensity increases, GI response increases like monotonically. It's almost like there's a step. So I think it was like LT1, LT2, and what you see is most probably from anything from 50% to 60%, the athletes can tolerate a large amount of carbohydrates. They're not going to, it doesn't really matter how much carbohydrates they consume. The GI, they're able to kind of metabolize that, and the GI tolerance is relatively quite high. They won't get that much GI issues. But once the exercise intensity kind of goes to maybe above 65%, that's when it kind of increases quite drastically. And that's where you get a significant increase in GI responses. And when we looked at the research, if you looked at the methodologies, it was very much on that lower intensity. So it was really hard to almost like stress test the hydrogel technology because the intensity was so low. And that's really why they never really saw a performance benefit, not only between the hydrogel technology, but also with the GI tolerance of the athletes. But there's research now out there, and a big component of my PhD was very much driven on understanding the hydrogel technology and kind of how it works. And there is evidence now that's shown. And a big factor is, yes, we have like scientific evidence that shows that the technology works. We have done like MRI studies to really understand how the hydrogel forms in the stomach. So really, and we're still in that kind of like development phase. But I think it just comes down to the athletes, like the athlete response. Like we've fueled like every world marathon major winner, an Olympic and world champion.
Eliud Kipchoge, right?
Exactly, yeah. From 2017, that's male and female. We're very dominant within cycling. We're very dominant now within ultra running. And a big factor of that is just because how the hydrogel delivers the carbohydrates. And for us at Maurten, it's really difficult because when you look at, say, a gel or a drink mix of sachets, they look relatively similar to kind of a traditional carbohydrate gel or drink mix. But how the hydrogel delivers the carbohydrates through the GI tract is completely different, and the function there is different. So for us, we get the validation from the elite athletes. Like, we know it works, and we now have the scientific data. But at the same time, it would be good to have more.
Isn't there like I think it's the hydrogel. Isn't like the origin story of the hydrogel like a accidental invention? I thought there was something regarding like dentists or something like that. Are you able to tell that story?
Yeah, it's good knowledge. It very much started from the co-founder, one of the co-founders and the CEO. Yeah, he went to the dentist, and the dentist kind of said, you must, like, he knew he was kind of taking part in endurance sport just because of his dental hygiene has been significantly impaired, and he thought of a way of how to kind of still consume large quantities of carbohydrates without having a massive impact on the dental hygiene. And one of the co-founders has had a background in kind of drug technology, and is a cancer researcher, and he thought if they could take the hydrogel technology, what's been used in the medical industry since like the 1980s, and utilize that within a sporting context, would that be able to kind of mitigate a lot of the dental impact? And what they found there is that, they was able to kind of mitigate a lot of the dental impact, helped kind of improve dental hygiene, which, again, if we're coming back to ultra endurance event, that's one of the biggest stresses that goes on the bodies. Yes, like, you get massive muscular stress, your GI system goes through a massive stress because it's processing, but the mouth goes through a significant stress as well.
Yes.
You must probably know, like, athletes, they tend to have pretty poor especially endurance athletes, pretty poor dental hygiene, and that's just because really when you're ingesting large quantities of carbohydrates, you're just ingesting sugar, so it is naturally going to have an impact. And one of the benefits of like the hydrogel technology is it alleviates that. It all happened relatively quite quick. They created the first kind of initial prototypes, realized that it would work within dental hygiene, and then they started to kind of figure out quite early on that because the hydrogel delivers the carbohydrates differently and is able to kind of help with the transportability through the GI tract, they thought actually it could maybe be beneficial for, say, endurance athletes. And actually one of the kind of the first group of athletes to ever test the product was Kenavisa Bicarbonate during the sub 2 attempt. So there was a sub 2 attempt before the Knight did the breaking 2 attempt, and the sub 2 attempt was led by a researcher called Yannis Pistalis, and he wanted like the first group of athletes to break the sub 2 hour marathon in kind of normal conditions. And there's a big project, so Maurten got in contact with them and just said, we have this technology, can you test it? So it's crazy to think like one of the first athletes was most probably one of the best in the world, and really from that moment, once they kind of tested it, Kenavisa Bicarbonate really struggled to ingest carbohydrates, and then it was almost immediately he went from able to ingest nothing to a large quantity.
Wow.
And then it kind of spread almost a bit like crazy, like wildfire, all through the elite athletes. So, and that's kind of where we are to now, like where we are today. We have almost like a large predominantly of the endurance field, from running, cycling, to Ironman, to ultra running. We have a big dominance, and it all comes down to just the technology and how it delivers the carbohydrates.
I think we've probably got time for one more question from each of us before some final thoughts. Did you have a follow-up to that?
No, I just wanted to hear the story. That was fantastic.
That was fantastic. Yeah. I think maybe my final question to you has to do with the taste of these products. And it's really about the taste of any products in general. When you ask athletes why they use a particular product, one of the first things for them is like, I enjoy the taste of it. I look forward to eating it or drinking it. But, a part of me wonders, like, how important is that factor in the fueling process? And maybe are there some ingredients in certain products that actually like make it taste better, but over time can actually undermine like the benefits of that gel or that liquid? And did Maurten come up with a specific taste because they realized that like the combination of that taste and all the other ingredients in our products, like that makes for like the most efficient and sustainable fueling strategy?
I think the taste really just comes from speaking with the athletes, and a big premise really for the hydrogel technology to work, it needs a pure ingredients, good quality of ingredients, but then also a really reduced ingredient list. And if you look at the Maurten products, they relatively have a very small ingredient list. And the big factor is that we don't include anything that is not there or not needed or doesn't have a function. And when it comes to like taste and flavor, when we spoke to a lot of athletes, they didn't want anything. They didn't want flavor because that kind of almost like takes away from the performance. And especially from an endurance event, what you tend to find is your taste buds fluctuate quite drastically. So something you might really enjoy at a low intensity or the first couple of hours of a race, by the time you've got 3 or 4 hours in, it's almost the last thing you'd want to have. And the idea really of having a neutral taste is that we want to make sure that athletes consistently fuel throughout the duration of the event, and have consistent periods of fueling. Not have I had a really good the first 2 hours, and then I didn't like the taste, and then I kind of slipped for like 2 hour middle period, and then I picked it back up. It's more about having that consistent fueling. And when we spoke to athletes, the easiest way to really manage that is to have a neutral flavor, because it means that you might not love it at the beginning, or you might not love it at the end, but how you kind of perceive it, because it's neutral, will be pretty much consistent. And that's the whole premise, is to have a consistent intake.
I've always been a fan of eliminating the emotional aspect of fueling, and just like, my car doesn't complain or not when I fill the gas tank with fuel. It's like, what if I could just like fuel and not be like, oh, this sucks or this is great, and it just be fuel.
I think that's where we're getting now, especially with like ultra endurance. It's getting quicker. Like it's getting the science is starting to kind of grow, and it's coming down to is like for some, like for the top end, it's event where they're not there for fun. Yeah, they love the sport, but they're there to kind of get performance out. And when it comes to kind of fueling, it's just the more you can have, the better. And the way to have more is to kind of have it in natural, neutral form. And that's kind of the whole premise of it.
Well, Josh, it has been such a pleasure to have you here. I know I learned a ton. I'm sure Brett did too. We're really grateful for what you do in the sport and the testing and the results you're providing, and just giving more clarity to the community on how to have an enjoyable and breakthrough type experience out there on the course. And I'm sure there are already people racing this Saturday at Western that are deploying bits and pieces or all of what you've talked about, which is exciting. We'll make sure to link to all of Maurten's channels in the show notes of this episode, but are there any final thoughts you have or calls to action for listeners and viewers as it relates to either Maurten or just their nutrition in endurance sport in general?
I would say a big component is definitely just looking at your electrolytes and your sodium intake. There's a big kind of argument, especially in the scientific literature, in the sense of it's starting to show that having a significant sodium intake can also have a negative impact on your performance, because especially in like hot environments, the more kind of sodium you have, it can increase your sweat rate and make you a lot more salty sweater, and that can almost be quite detrimental over, say, a really prolonged period. And I think especially with an ultra endurance running, there's a very much kind of there's always been the case of I need to kind of replenish my salts and my electrolytes. I need to have a high intake. But that's not relatively the case. You don't need a significant amount of sodium. The body is really well regulated and calibrated to kind of retain that. And just by having more sodium, it means it starts to accelerate the use of sodium in the body, which means you kind of will lose more. So I think that's something like for us, like over these like the next couple of days, we're doing a lot of testing with Tom to kind of evaluate his fluid intake, and we're doing a series of tests, but then also we're looking at his carbohydrate intake, his glucose response, his lactate. We're also going to be evaluating his acid-base balance, and then also his electrolyte profile throughout the race. So yeah, like for us, it's like, again, there's not much research there, but the research now is very much swaying away to that. So we want to kind of help as much as possible.
Are there going to be any viral moments on the Western States live stream of Tom eating any mystery fluids that people are going to be questioning, just like Killian at Courmayeur?
Maybe. Yes, maybe.
Heard it here first.
Yeah. There'll be definitely some blood testing, hopefully. It really much depends on kind of how the race is panning out. The whole idea is we've done a series of testing now in the first initial days. So we'll get some data, even if we don't do much testing with Tom during the race. Because, again, the performance always comes first. So if it comes to a point where he can't afford to have 2 minutes with me to kind of take some blood and have a bit of a discussion, then the things will definitely they're not needed. The performance always comes first. So, but you may see some interesting things.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to see what gets what we learn from Tom's experience at Western States this year. And I love that there's nutrition companies like Maurten that are really pushing the boundaries of performance nutrition from the emphasis of science and looking to push the sports boundaries in that way. So yeah, thank you so much for
thank you so much
and going into the weeds a little bit with us on all things endurance nutrition.
Thank you. Thanks.